name is Savitri, and I am an engineering mentor at Codesmith. So I teach a few lectures for our full-time remote immersive program, as well as our part-time remote immersive program. And I myself went through Codesmith. I attended the full-time remote immersive program, and yeah, I loved it, and I've been here ever since. But before Codesmith, I studied art history and economics, so completely unrelated field. And I actually worked in the auction industry for about 6 years before I realized that it wasn't really for me, and I wanted to kind of pivot my career. So I did a lot of self-studying, did a lot of online tutorials, and took advantage of a lot of those free online resources that exist, and ultimately ended up at Codesmith. So I guess I share that because I just want to emphasize the fact that you do not need to have a technical background to kind of make this change into software engineering. If I can do it, any of you guys can do it too. But if you do have any other foundational knowledge of software engineering or computer science, whatever, even better, all the more power to you. So, okay, let's jump into things for tonight. We're going to be covering HTML and CSS, and a little bit of how these kind of two pieces play into the whole world of web development, is that they are the part of the main three languages that kind of run natively in a web browser. So we have our HTML, our CSS, and then that third language is going to be JavaScript. So these three will run natively in a browser and work together. So HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language, is sort of like the standard markup language for creating web pages and web applications. Then we have CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's a style sheet language used to describe the presentation or the styling of a web page. And then we've got our good old JavaScript here. And JavaScript is what's called an object-oriented computer programming language. And it's typically used to create interactivity or functionality within your web application. So if we're considering going to you opening up your browser like Google Chrome or Firefox or Microsoft Edge, and you're typing in www.google.com, when we actually hit enter, what we're doing is we are sending a request to a server to then send us back some kind of information. That kind of information we're getting back is going to be in HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And that's what will kind of work together to display this www.google.com on your web page, right? So your browser can read HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and this is the kind of language they read. But to actually make those requests to a server, they're going to use something called HTTP. And HTTP just stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And a protocol is just it's like a set of rules, right, for how to do something. So HTTP is the standard set of rules that define how these kind of messages are being sent between the browser and the server. The browser can also sometimes be referred to as the client. So if you hear that word used, they're kind of interchangeable. So then we have our servers, which are typically running on some kind of backend framework, and they're programmed with languages like sometimes with JavaScript or Python or Java, etc. So when requests are received by the servers, they're going to kind of do some kind of logic and then send a response back to the client. Again, that response is being sent in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so that when your browser receives that response, it can kind of parse through all that data and then display it and render it on your screen. So if we focus a little bit now on HTML, we're going to kind of talk about the intricacies of what makes up an HTML element in just a little bit here. But could maybe someone in their own words kind of tell me what HTML is used for? Vince, how would you describe HTML and what is it used for?
HTML, it describes the structure of the web page. I guess there's like paragraphs, or here's where the picture goes and stuff like that. That's as far as I know. Yeah, and then you can put content inside. Yeah,
exactly. It gives us the basic structure of our web page. And we're going to actually talk about some of the common HTML tags. That's a key word here. Some of the common HTML tags that you're going to come across. So first, HTML, like we said, hypertext markup language. Markup language, all it is a computer language that uses something called tags to then define parts of the document. So let's kind of get into an HTML element and what a tag might be. So tags are the way in which we can mark up text, right? In this case, we're working with an HTML element, and it's made up of 3 parts here. We've got our opening tag, which is this like less than sign, and then an H1, and then a greater than sign. Then we have a closing tag, and it looks very similar to our opening tag, but it has a / ahead of the H1. Okay, that's how we know it's a closing tag, because it has this / here. And then sitting in between those tags is going to be what's called our content. So in this case, we want to display the text hello world as an H1 tag. And this is the syntax for doing that. All these pieces together are what's called an HTML element. So this entire thing would be referred to as one element. Okay. So here we have an HTML document. We kind of have the anatomy of this document broken down into a few different pieces. So an HTML document is where you're going to include all of the necessary pieces of your web page. And these pieces are what is going to be read or consumed by your browser and interpreted as HTML in this case. So first we have this kind of doc type declaration, and it always comes as like the first thing in your document. Is anyone familiar with this doc type declaration? Does anyone know what it's used for? You have any thoughts? Eli, have you used the doc type declaration before? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, only when trying to do some HTML coding. If I had to, if I had to just venture a guess into what it's actually doing, I would imagine it's telling us what markup language we're dealing with. It probably is some kind of object or class of. I guess it just kind of points to the name of the document, maybe, or something. I'm just guessing, really, though.
Yeah, no. Those are very fair guesses. But yeah, you kind of had it right there in the beginning, where it's a declaration that it's basically it's instructing your browser. So whoever's receiving this document, it's instructing it what version of HTML the page is going to be written in. So it's telling it, hey, I'm sending you HTML, and in this case, we're going to be using HTML5, which is like the most recent version. So yep, you hit it right on the nail. And then we use this HTML tag here, and it kind of acts as a container for all the rest of our HTML elements within it. So you'll notice we've got our opening HTML tag here, and then it closes down here, right? Because we've got that /. So everything within the HTML tag could be considered its content, right? But we've got more tags in here. And inside of this head tag, we've got another tag inside of there. And so all these little pieces are HTML elements, and then together, this could be called an HTML document. So we've got this head tag, and what the head tag represents is all of the metadata for our web page. And metadata is just data about data, basically. And it's typically where you're going to put information that you don't want your user to see. So you could put things like the page description, or the author of the document, or the date it was last modified. In this example, we're using a title tag that says welcome to Codesmith. And a title tag is a little bit of a funny one because it actually is seen by a user, but it's not seen in the window of the browser. It's seen in the browser tab at the very top, where, like, do you ever notice you have a bunch of tabs open and you can kind of read a little bit of what each one represents? Well, that text lives in this title tag, which lives inside of this head tag. Okay, so that's the head portion. Then the other part of the anatomy is the body. And the body tag is used to encapsulate all of the content on the web page that you do want the user to see, right? So here we've got an H1 tag. So we've seen this one before, and we'll touch on H1 tags in a little bit. But basically, all our web page says right now is Intro to JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Okay, so that's kind of like the anatomy of an HTML document. Now, let's talk about the 6 main types of HTML tags that you're going to be coming into interaction with a lot. So the first one is this body tag. I know we kind of just talked about it, but again, to recap, the body tag element represents the content of an HTML document, and that's where everything that will be presented to the user is going to be. So in the body element, you can put things like text or images and other elements that will then together illustrate your entire web page. Okay, so here in this snippet of code, we've got a body tag that just has an H1 tag within it. And so if we look on this little laptop here, us as the users are seeing hello world on the screen. Okay. All right. Then we have our H tags, and we've already seen this one a couple of times now, but H tags actually, there's 6 of them, and they range from H1 to H6. The larger the number, so like 6, correlates to the size, and it actually means that's the smallest size. So the higher the number, the smaller the size, whereas the lower the number, the larger the size. And in this code snippet example, you can see that we're using 3 different H tags, and the way that they're being rendered on the screen is that they're going from largest to smallest. And you can actually kind of configure this sizing, this font sizing, using CSS, but this is just kind of like a default thing that HTML kind of gives us, which can come in handy sometimes, but it gives us this kind of default sizing for our font. But yeah, does anyone have any questions so far on some of these tags we've been talking about? Or can I get thumbs? How about that? Everything sound good so far? Okay. All right, sweet. If you do have any questions, go ahead, just use the raise hand feature, and I'll be happy to answer them during the lecture too. Okay, next we have our paragraph tags. Paragraph tags are also called P tags because it's just a little P, and they define paragraphs, or typically just like sentences and text. And so in this example, you can see we've got a P tag here, and all it says is I'm a paragraph, and then that's what we kind of get on our web page. So that's kind of really all it is. It's where you can place, some of the important text information on your page. In the example of, like, let's say a newspaper article, you may want to have like the title of your newspaper in like a H1 tag, right? Because you want it to be the biggest, boldest thing on your web page. It could be like, you know, the Liz Times or something. And then the content of the articles, you might want to, well, let's see, have like one small article on like, oh, like how to bake the best chocolate chip cookies. And you might want to like have that be like an H3 tag. And then you might want to have like the recipe written below it, and you want it to be a little bit smaller. You can kind of write those out in like, I don't know, a P tag, right? If you're trying to describe like the cookie, like these are the best cookies you'll ever eat, and I'm going to show you how. So different ways, you know, you have a lot of flexibility with these different tags, but these are some of the main ones that you'll use to write or to add text, right? We also have these really handy list tags, and list tags are beneficial because, well, there's two types actually. First, there is an ordered list. So an ordered list would be something that requires some sort of like numbering system, or like you might want to use it if like the order of your list really matters, right? Whereas an unordered list doesn't have this kind of like numerical or chronological aspect to it. All it does is give bullets next to each item, right? Because the order doesn't really matter in that case. A really good example for this would be going back to our little chocolate chip cookie recipe. So let's say we've got the description of what a recipe is, and then we're saying, okay, here are all the ingredients you're going to need to buy. Well, I could list out those ingredients using an unordered list, because it doesn't matter if you buy it flour, chocolate chips, milk, you could buy it in any order, but you're going to need all these things, right? And then the instructions, now that's different, right? We have very specific instructions that you need to follow in a specific order. So you may want to use an ordered list tag to have, you know, those handy dandy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 next to each step of your instructions. So something to note about these list tags, and you may have already noticed it here on the left-hand side, is that our ordered list and our unordered list have additional tags within them. And these are called list item tags. So the list item tag is what would go around the actual content for what each list item you would want to represent on your page, right? So really important here is you can have an ordered list, but it won't actually display anything until you wrap the content within a list item tag. Okay, so an unordered list and an ordered list tag need these list items to actually create these lists. Okay, so they go kind of hand in hand. Can I get thumbs on list tags so far? Okay, sweet. Right. Then we have our anchor tags and our image tags. So anchor tags are typically used for things like creating, why am I blanking on the word here? A hyperlink. So you know how if you can see like some text on the screen, and then when you hover over it, you know that it's gonna like take you somewhere else, and then you click on it and it opens up another tab or a new window with a different website. The way that you would create that with HTML is by using an anchor tag, or an A tag is what they're called. So basically you would anchor some additional resource or some additional web page to maybe some content on your web page. So in this case, what would happen if I were to click on this cat's world text here in the browser? Let's see, Deanna, what do you think?
If you click on that, it will take you to the cats.com webpage.
Yeah, yep, exactly. Yeah. Exactly right. And it's going to take us to this cats.com website because we've added something in with our anchor tag here. We've added an href. And this href here is called an attribute. So this attribute on our A tag is going to refer to where the like resource where it lives. So when I click on this content or this text of Cat's World, this is the place that I'm going to be taken to. So that's how the href attribute is being used. Then we have our image tag here, right? Which displays this cute little image of these cats. Does anyone notice anything different about our image tag? Is there something maybe missing? Let's see, Jimmy, are you able to notice anything different about this image tag compared to like the other tags we've been looking at?
Yeah, so it's self-closing. It has that backslash within the first tag, and also has a different attribute.
Yes, you highlighted two things. Awesome. So first, like you said, it is a self-closing tag, which means it doesn't have a closing tag at the end of it, right? We've got this A tag here that starts with an opening tag. Then we have our content. Then we have our closing tag, right? Well, with an image, the content is the image itself, right? So the only reason you need an opening and a closing tag would be like to tell the browser, hey, everything in between these two things are what's going to be a part of this HTML element. Whereas with an image, you don't need to tell it that because there is no content. The content itself is going to be the image. So that's why you don't need an additional tag to kind of wrap around the entire content, right? And second point you mentioned here was this new attribute called SRC, or source. And the source attribute, what this does is it allows you to specify the location or the location of an image. And in this case, the location of that image is at www.cats.com/image1. You could also have the source or the resource be somewhere on your local machine, like on your computer. You could say the source is like Savitri /documents/images/cute cat photo. You know what I mean? So basically, wherever the image is located that you are trying to display is going to go here with this source attribute. Okay. Can I get thumbs so far on, I guess, just kind of these two tags as well as attributes in general? Yeah, Eli, do you have a question?
Well, yeah, I think you mostly answered it, but just one thing I want to know is like, if you did source the image from your computer and then maybe you turned your computer off, then how would HTML and JavaScript and manage to find the image? Because your computer's not putting it up because it would be off, right?
So the file would still be accessible because really what you're doing is you're telling this image tag where it can find the image to then display. And so if the location of that image happens to be on your local machine, as long as you give it the correct file path, it will still be able to access it if your computer is off. However, I will say that, you know, for a lot of applications, you'll end up creating like specific files within your application or for your web page, and that file will contain like all of the images that you plan to be using maybe for this project. And so that file of images would then live in the same or relatively close location as the rest of your application, or it'll live really close by to your HTML document. I don't want to go too much into the weeds there, but
yeah, of course. But generally, it's just better coding practice to just upload everything to some kind of cloud, like file database thing, I guess is what you're getting at.
Yeah. So if you were like working on a production level application, or if you were creating like a public website that you know were planning to have a ton of like traffic to, yes, you do not want to have the source of that application on your local machine because it would cause a lot of issues with like security, but also just like fault tolerance. If something were to happen to your computer, and it could, your website could go down. So, but yeah, great question. If there are no other questions so far, let's jump into our last kind of main HTML tag of these top 6. Okay, so then we have our div tags, and div just stands for division. And the div tag, it's a really common tag that you'll come across. And all it really is used for is to create kind of like containers for other HTML elements. So in this kind of code snippet here, you'll notice we've got 2 div tags. And inside of each div tag is a p tag, right? It's a p tag that says div1 and div2. Now all we see on our screen is div1 and div2, but you'll notice that the spacing around div1 and div2 is like blue and red. And that's because we added some attribute. We added an attribute here. It's called the style attribute. And basically what that does is it allows us to add some styling to each HTML element. And in this case, we are giving our div tag a background color of blue and a background color of red. And so what you see on the screen is every part of the screen that's blue is the div tag. There's no content, or the div tag doesn't actually like contain anything, right? It's a container for other HTML elements. So it does exist, right? But as far as like what you'll actually see in this div, you're going to see the p tag here, right? But this kind of adding color to the div tags allows you to see visually the spacing that these div tags represent on the browser window. Okay, so div tags are really handy for kind of sectioning off different parts of your web page, and using as a container for other HTML elements that you may want to kind of like organize in a certain way. Yeah, so that's kind of like the gist of what a div tag is. It's a really common tag that you'll come across, but again, it's just kind of think of it as a container as far as like what it can do. Okay. So we talked about a few different tags here. So to create text, we can use our handy dandy H tags, right? H1 through 6, 1 being the largest size and 6 being the smallest. Then we have our P tags, or our paragraph tags, that's used to just add kind of like important text. Then we have our list tags and our list item tag, right? And we have our ordered lists, which gives us things like 1, 2, and 3 next to each list item automatically. And then we also have unordered lists, where if the list doesn't, or if the order doesn't really matter, it'll just give us simple bullet points next to each list item, right? Then we have images. So we've got our image tag that we can give a source attribute, or SRC attribute, and the value of that attribute is going to be the location of our image, right? And image tags are self-closing. Then we have our A tag, or our anchor tag, and this can be used to anchor another, like a web page, to certain content on our screen. So to create like hyperlinks. And then we've got our handy dandy container div tags that we just saw in the previous slide. So together with these different tags, we can create a very basic, not so pretty web page like the one on this screen here. So we've got a lot of content, but not a lot of style here, right? It's not very pretty. And that's where CSS comes in. So can anyone kind of tell me in their own words what CSS is used for? How about Ayo?
CSS is like the design aspect of it, or the decoration or design.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like what adds all the like bells and whistles, like the kind of like the styling. It gives it some life, right? So exactly that. CSS, again, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It is used to basically describe the presentation of our HTML elements on our document. All right, so now let's get into the kind of like anatomy of a CSS rule. So with HTML, we had HTML elements, right? That was like the tags with the content, and together that was called an element. In CSS, we have rules, okay? So the anatomy of a CSS rule contains a selector, and the selector is basically how you tell CSS which element or elements you want to apply this CSS rule to. So you're selecting the piece of HTML that you want to apply the rule to. So in this case, we are using H1. This is called a tag selector because we're using the tag's name. And what this rule will do is it will grab all of the H1 elements and apply this rule to those elements. So in the rule, we've got a declaration. And in the declaration, we've got two pieces. The first piece is going to be the property. So you've got, I mean, I feel like this is pretty intuitive, but what this first declaration is saying is we want to make the color blue, right? And it's actually, you know, when I was first learning this, I was like, why is it called color and not font color? But by just specifying color here, we're actually targeting the font color. So we're saying turn the font color blue. So this first piece or this property is like, okay, well, what do you want to turn blue? Do you want to turn the color blue? Do you want to turn the background color blue? Do you know, like what part of it do you want me to turn blue? So that's where the property goes. Then the second part is going to be the value. This goes after the semicolon. So you've identified the properties. You're like, okay, I know I'm messing with the font color. What value do you want me to actually make it? Do you want me to make it blue? Do you want me to make it yellow or purple? Whatever value you want is going to go after the semicolon, or I'm sorry, the colon. So those two pieces together make up our declaration. If you want to have multiple declarations in one rule, you can definitely do so by just adding a semicolon between the two. So each declaration actually does need to end with a semicolon. So this is also how CSS will be able to identify where one declaration starts and where another begins. All right, so I briefly talked about these selectors, right? How we're telling CSS which elements to actually apply these rules to. 3 selectors we're going to talk about are tag name selectors, ID selectors, and class selectors. So using classes to apply styles. So in this top right snippet of code, you can see here we've got a few divs with a few p tags, but you'll notice we've got this attribute here, right? It's that piece of piece of code that's got this like keyword, then an equal sign, and then a value. So the class attribute here is being applied to this div tag, and the value of the class is special. So classes can be used to almost give a category, assign a category to your HTML elements. So we are giving this div tag the category of special. We're categorizing this div tag as special. So now these two can kind of be considered in their own class, in their own category. So that if we then wanted to apply specific styling rules to these two tags, we can refer to these two tags using the category that they're a part of, right? The class name that we've given them. So the syntax for using a class selector is to use a period or a dot before the name of the class that you're trying to target, right? So by using this dot notation, I can say dot special, meaning grab all of the HTML elements that have a class of special, and then apply these CSS declarations to those HTML elements. And as a result, we get this over here on the right-hand side of the screen, where we are giving it a margin of 10 pixels. We're changing the width. We're adding a background color as well as the font color. Yet this div gets nothing, right? Because this div is not a part of the class special. We did not give it that attribute class of special, okay? Can I get thumbs so far on class attributes? Yeah, okay, cool. All right, so next we have using tags to apply styles. So in that first example, we used an H1 tag to select all of the H1s. By doing that, basically it's going to grab every single element that is the selected element for your CSS rule. So in this case, we're saying grab all of the P tags and apply this CSS rule or these declarations to all of the P tags, which is fine. If sometimes you do want to target all of one type of tag, you know, and you want to add very specific styling to every single one, by all means, use the tag selector. And in this case, we've got, let's see, 2 P tags here, right? One that says goodbye world and one that says Codesmith is awesome. So by adding this specific styling to all of our P tags, we can now see that represented on our little laptop screen here, right? They've got this red border as well as a different font. Okay. Then we have ID selectors. So IDs, you'll notice, are very similar, or it's a very similar syntax to the classes, right? So it's an attribute. It's going on the opening tag, but IDs are different than classes because you can only assign one type of ID for the entire document. So you can have multiple elements with IDs, but the value of that ID has to be unique for every single one. So like with classes, you can kind of like create a category and then use that category to describe a bunch of different elements. But with IDs, you can only use that ID to describe one element. So because I've used the ID of heading here for my H1, I'm not going to be able to use the ID of heading for any other of my elements. I could maybe create a different ID and call it ID footer or ID unicorn. It could literally be whatever you want. But once I've used it once, I can't use it again. Or it's considered really bad practice, and you'll typically get some errors if you use it more than once. I think it technically could be possible, maybe like it might be like smart enough to like let you do that, but it's really bad practice. So using IDs is really handy if you want to target like one specific element of many. In this case, I am targeting the heading ID, and you'll notice this little pound sign or this hash symbol here, and that is the syntax that CSS uses to look for an ID. So we're saying look for an ID of heading, and then apply this rule to that element. So we say, okay, hash heading, and it goes, oh, I've got an ID here of heading. And now let me apply some styling to it, where I'll make it blue, I'll align the text to be centered, and I'm also going to make the font size 50 pixels. Okay, so this is what it would look like once the CSS rule has been applied to the HTML element. Can I get thumbs on ID selectors? Yeah, Eli.
So this might, I think this probably is going to sound like a kind of silly question, but like, isn't there some kind of documentation that just lists like all of the font colors and everything? Because I imagine we're not just recalling all the types of yellow from memory.
Yeah. So there are dozens, if not hundreds, of resources that have all of the like official like text words to describe different colors, because like you said, there are hundreds of shades of all of these colors that you would have access to. And there's even, so typically you wouldn't even actually spell out the word blue. You would likely use a different syntax to describe the color, called like RGB. But I don't want to get too much into that, but basically CSS, there is an entire library of all the different colors that you have access to. So definitely look into some different resources that you can maybe save to your browser tabs. Or there's actually some cool Chrome extensions that exist where you can essentially get like a color picker, and like, let's say you find a really cool color on a website, you can then like click on that color and it'll tell you the code to like type in your CSS that will then represent that color. So like you can literally get that exact same color in your code by using that color picker. So yeah, there's a lot you can do out there, a lot of cool resources, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. So all right, so we talked about the color, the font size. We briefly touched on like text align and font family and all these other different CSS declarations, but I'm gonna jump us into a little bit of a demo here. And we're gonna do a little bit of CSS styling to a really, really simple web page. So I just want to stay on the screen for just a minute so that you guys can kind of read through, because we're going to need to actually implement some styling to these different properties here. So we've got our color, which we know is the font color. We've got our font size, which is like the size of the font. Then we've got text align, which I think if we saw in this, in this example, we centered the text, right? The alignment of the text was set to center, and that's what brought it to the middle of our page. Okay, so that's text align. Font family would be like Times New Roman or Arial, Comic Sans, things like that. So that would give the font, that would be the font family. We've got things called border, which basically adds a border around the HTML element. We've got the width, we've got the height, we've got things called margin and padding. I'm not going to get too much into what margin and padding are, but just think of them as existing as like a buffer or almost like some spacing above all the edges of an HTML element. So if you wanted to kind of add some spacing on the top and bottom or the left and right to kind of push out elements around it, you could adjust the margin and the padding. So with that, let me exit out of full screen and jump on over to this demo. Okay, let me make this a little bit bigger. All right, how is the size of this? Can you guys see it okay? Should I make it a little bit bigger? Looks good, okay. All right, so on the left-hand side, we've got, let me make this a little shorter, let's scroll up. Okay, on the left-hand side, we've got a simple HTML document, right? We've got our doc type here. Then we've got our HTML tag that's wrapping all of our other HTML elements inside of it. Then we've got this head tag that says Intro to HTML and CSS. And remember, this title is what appears in the tab of our browser. So if I were to like change this to a slash, give it a minute. Give it a minute. Oh, maybe I need to save it a different way. And then refresh. Let's try this. Oh, I'm sorry. This, of course, is not going to update because this is the name. It's pulling the title from their actual application, and it's setting my title as the title of this document. So, okay, that was a bad example. But trust me, the rest of the stuff we're going to be editing is going to be displayed down here in this kind of like test browser window that we've got set up. So with that, we have our HTML document. On the right, we have our CSS document, which is currently empty. And on the bottom here is our browser window, or it's our mock browser window. Okay, so just kind of like based on what the text is that's written. Let me move this thing over here. Got to rearrange you guys again. Okay, so just kind of based on what the text is saying, how could we move this HTML element all the way to the right? Let's see. Liz, do you have any idea how we could maybe align this text all the way to the right? No? Does anyone want to help Liz out here? Anyone have any ideas on how we could maybe align this text to the right? Eli, looks like you're, oh, Deanna?
Oh, we would need to add a text align element. I think it would be called an element to be text align right, but I don't know where to put it. So maybe
Okay.
Eli.
No, that's all good. That's all good. We are here to learn, and I'm going to help you guys out with this one a little bit. So we know that to target, we know we can create a CSS rule, but in order for CSS to know where to apply that rule, we're going to have to select an HTML element using a selector, right? So we talked about those tag selectors, ID selectors, and class selectors. So right now we know that this move me all the way to the right is represented right here in our HTML, right? And this is an H1 tag. So we could select this H1 by using a tag selector like H1, and then we've got some curly braces, and now we can add a declaration, right? And the declaration has two parts. It's got the property and the value. So the property in this case is going to be text align. And the value, well, we want to align the text all the way to the right. So I can just say right. And then you can see that it moved it all the way to the right, just like that, because it found the H1 tag by using this selector, and then it applied this rule, or I'm sorry, this declaration to that element. So this together is called a CSS rule. All right, let's try this next one. So it's saying to turn me orange. Mike, do you have any ideas how we can turn this piece orange?
Not really. I just catching. I knew the last one we had to do something with the line, but that was pretty much it. So this one I'm not really sure.
All right. Liz, you got was that a hand?
Is this one, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is this when you use the hashtag or the pound sign? Because it has the ID?
Ah, good eye. Yeah.
So hash and then paragraph 1.
So, okay, so you're real close there. So the hash is definitely something we could use to select the ID to apply the rule to. So because you identified that this p tag has a unique ID of paragraph 1, we can use the ID selector to grab that HTML element to apply some kind of like styling to. So the syntax is going to be that # because it's an ID, but then we're going to specify the name of the ID. And in this case, it's paragraph 1. And then how can we turn the color of the font orange?
So do you just add a property color and then assign it the value of orange?
Yes. Exactly.
Oh.
Exactly. You nailed it. Cool. All right. Then we've got some list items here, right? And we're using an ordered list, and that's what's giving us this 1, 2, and 3 ahead of each list item. So let's see. Lou, would you be able to help us out here? How could we make the font size for all of the list items to be 25 pixels?
Sure. So it looks like, can we just do a global, basically, list item? I don't know what you call them. I mean, basically, we address all list items to be the same. Does that make sense?
So we could use the tag selector because we want to grab all of the list items. All right, and then what?
And then we're going to do a font size and make it 25 pixels. We'll do margin at 30 pixels on the next line, I think is how they typically.
All right, so we saw that this CSS rule did make all the list items 25 pixels. So then the next line here is to give this list item, so only this one, a margin of 30 pixels.
Oh, just that one.
Yeah. So how could we just target that single list item? We don't want this rule to affect the others. Eli, is that a hand up?
Yeah, I do see that some of these list items have an ID equals item 1 and 3, so I think that we probably would go to CSS and put list li, and then somewhere you put that item name there, or the ID name.
Yes, exactly. So I realized there was a typo, but you identified it. So each of these list items has a unique ID. And so if we want to target only one of the list items, well, we can target its ID. So what is the syntax for that, Eli? Do you recall? How would we tell CSS?
I think that we probably would put it outside of the curly brackets. I'm not recalling exactly. I'm just going to try to do this from memory, but I think outside of the curly brackets, and I would imagine you might just put ID equals item 2 in quotation marks in CSS.
Okay, so what we have over here in our HTML is where we're actually giving this list item an ID of item 2. But then to select that item, we have to use an ID selector in CSS. And so the syntax for an ID selector is by using this hash symbol. This hash symbol represents
that's right,
an ID. Yeah, exactly. And then after this hash symbol, we're actually going to put the value of the ID. So you were right with item -2, but that item -2 has to go after this hash symbol. So now we've selected our HTML element with a unique ID of item -2. How can we specify that we want to give it a margin of 30 pixels? Just kind of like intuitively.
Are you asking me or someone else?
Yeah, sorry, I was still sticking with you, if that's all right.
Well, we had we had those like there are those two different types of buffers. There's like a border, and then there was another buffer name from earlier in the slides.
Yeah.
So we would
Padding and margin were the two.
Yeah, padding and margin, that's right. So I would think you could do either padding or margin equals 30.
All right. And when you say equals, do you mean like this?
That's what I would think. That's what I would think. Maybe this thing would just run an error if I did that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, let's actually just see. So equals 30, like that.
And well, you'd put a semicolon after it because I think that's how you're supposed to conclude a declaration. Or you could actually, or I think we've been using the semicolons the entire time. So that probably makes a lot more sense. But I don't know what would happen if you did equal. Maybe it would work.
So I'll click save again here, but it doesn't look like it's applying that rule. We're not getting an error, but that's probably because we're using a website. We're using CodePen, but I will
probably the colon is better though.
Yes, exactly right. So the syntax does require this colon, right, to separate the property and the value. Okay, and so together, this makes up a declaration. So we've given it a margin of 30, but it's like 30. What is 30? What does 30 represent? Well, we need to tell it we want it to represent 30 pixels. That is the unit of measurement we are going to be using. So by adding that little px in, we can now see we've given it a margin all the way around of 30 pixels. And so now we get kind of some space on the top, the bottom, as well as the left. You can't really see it on the right because there's nothing on the right side of it, but just know that it's there. So yeah, excellent job. Then let's see, Tristan, are you still around, my friend? Would you like to help us out with this next one here? Give the first and third list item Arial font.
Yeah. Sorry, one sec. Yeah, so you just you do the same thing you did with item 2, hashtag item 3 with brackets.
Okay, and why are we doing it like this?
Because you just want to do the third one.
Okay, so actually,
and the third one. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that part.
No worries. Yeah, so we want to try and target the first and the third item. So this item and this item.
Can you do and operators in HTML? Does that work? So could you do hashtag item 1 and?
So actually, it does not support the and operator, but that was a really clever guess. Really creative approach. I got to give you kudos for that one. But can you identify maybe something using one of the 3 selectors that we've talked about, right? Tag selectors, ID selectors, and class selectors. Can you think of a selector that would grab both of these elements for us and only these 2 elements?
I think you could just write item 1 and item 2, but you'd have to do them separately. I don't know how you do them together.
For sure. Yeah. Liz, are you kind of, you look like you're...
Is that when you use the dot?
Yeah.
Like to establish the class?
Yes, exactly. Okay.
So dot selected item?
So, yep, you nailed it.
So there's not any way to do like what he was saying with the hash ID, this and that, like comma or.
So there is some additional syntax that you could use to combine or to specify. I want to be careful with my verbiage here, but you could technically, how do I want to say this? it's not using a comma and an and symbol. There is a way to target multiple elements in addition to this syntax, but this is kind of like the base level. And from here, you'll be able to kind of build and weave in additional selectors. But using just the 3 selectors we've talked about, Liz, you totally nailed it. We've got these classes here, right? We've given these 2 list items a special category or a class of selected item, and only these 2 have it. So to target those 2 elements, we can access the class using dot notation, dot syntax, and then the name of the class. And in this case, you said it right, it's selected item. And this tells CSS, hey, grab me all the items, or I'm sorry, grab me all the elements that have a class of selected item. And then now that we've grabbed them, we can apply a styling to it. So how are we going to actually change the font to Arial?
So you just do just font and Arial. So font : Arial, semicolon. That.
Let's see what happens. It doesn't look like it's hitting it. But I'm gonna help you out with this one here. So for font, it's actually the CSS property name is called font family. So just kind of like how color, I always want to think it's font color, but it's font, but it's color. For font family, I always think it's font, but it's font family. So it just takes practice. But it's very specific with the keywords for the properties that you use. So, but yeah, you totally nailed it here. It's font family, and then you specified as Arial. And so now,
does it need to be capitalized, or if you put it lowercase, will it work, or just?
Let's see. Yeah, it still works, not capitalized.
Oh.
It's just a habit of mine to capitalize it. But yeah, good catch there. All right, we've got one more here down at the bottom. Let's see who can help us out. Io, would you be able to help us out here by giving this button a green border? How can we target this element here and give it a specific style? Uh-oh. I
So
think.
the button to put this out doesn't make a declaration on it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think the connection's kind of cutting out. It's a little hard to hear.
I think that. Sorry. I think he ends a declaration on it.
Oh, I think we lost him. Oh no. All right. Well, I might just pop this one over. Oh, is he back? I'd love to get their contribution, but Hey, Io, you're back.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Is it to make a declaration? But I honestly don't know where I would begin to. Like, I can go back in my notes, but
yeah. So sure. I guess the first part would be to use a selector to grab this element, right?
Grab that element, and then I kind of understand what I need to do, but I'm in the dark on how the most efficient way to do it, or how to do it.
Sure. Does anyone have any other ideas or want to help out Io here? Does anyone have any thoughts on how we could grab this element and then apply a CSS rule to it? What kind of selector could we use? Anyone feeling brave? What's the last one? Yeah, Eli.
I guess we would just say button. I mean,
Yeah, and why is that?
well, it's it's button in HTML, and so far, pretty much all the selectors in HTML seem to just mostly transfer over to CSS as the same name or something pretty similar to it. So I would imagine you just use something like the name button.
Yes, so we definitely can just use the name button, and by doing that, we're going to be using the tag selector, right? Because we're selecting this element based on the name of the tag. Whereas before we were using ID selector, like this is an ID selector, and up here we used a class selector, right? Because we're selecting the element based on the class or based on the ID. But as we see here, there is no ID and there is no class that we've given to this button element. So the only way to really access it is by using the name of the tag, by using the tag selector here. So we can do exactly that. We can say, whoops, CSS, grab me all the elements with the class, or I'm sorry, with the tag name button. And in this case, there is only one. So we are perfectly safe in doing this. Then we're going to give it a border. So for this declaration, the first part is the property. So the property is going to be called border.
Yep.
And then the second part of it is going to be the value. And this is where we can actually define what the border is going to look like, right? It's the value for this border. So the syntax here is a little bit different than what we've been seeing up above, where the border value here is going to consist of 3 parts. The first part is going to be the size of the border. And I'm going to stick with pixels here because that's what we've been using. And for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to give it a pretty thick border so we can see it. So I'm going to say, okay, the first part, give it a border of 4 pixels wide. The second part is going to be the type of border. So CSS has a few different kinds of borders. You could do like a dotted border or a solid border. So in this case, I'm just going to stick with solid. And then the third part of this value is going to be the color. So what color do we want this 4 pixel wide solid border to be?
Green.
Well, the screen says to make it green, so I'm going to do just that. And now we've got this thick green border around our button. That doesn't look very pretty, but that is how we could add a border around an HTML element. And you'll notice the syntax here, it takes 3 kind of like arguments, so to speak, and they're just separated by spaces, okay? But we still got to close it off with this little semicolon here, all right? So can I get thumbs on kind of this demo and some of the different things we touched on? Yeah? All right, sweet. But yeah, CodePen is a pretty fun website. It's really, really simple to use. So if you guys ever want to just tinker around with like your HTML and CSS, it also has a JavaScript option as well. So you could incorporate JavaScript into your kind of like test area. But yeah, so it's kind of fun to play with. Let us jump back into our slides here to kind of wrap things up. All right, here we go. Just thumbs, you can see my slides again, right? Okay, cool. All right, so we just touched on a lot of different CSS declarations using our selectors, right? Our tag selector, our ID selector, and our class selector. And once we selected the HTML element or elements, we were able to apply certain CSS styling to those elements. So that is basically all I have for you tonight. just as a kind of like next steps, like I said, we always offer these free workshops on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings. So if you enjoyed it tonight, definitely, see what other workshops we have offered. We've got a ton on JavaScript, as well as others on like how to whiteboard, and we've got those pair programming workshops. So definitely, if you're interested, feel free to attend some of those. Like I mentioned, we have the CSX online learning platform, the free online learning platform. Got a ton of cool algorithms and videos and kind of lectures on that. So again, it's free. So if you're interested, sign up. And once you do sign up, you'll get access to that Slack channel with thousands of other people who are literally on the same journey as you. So it's a really great community to kind of like, dabble in and kind of be involved with. So highly recommend that. Yeah, it's been great hanging with you guys tonight. Thank you all again for showing up tonight, and I hope you all had a nice time.